Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the international monetary system. We will discuss what affects exchange rates, what exchange rates are, how they can affect your business, and how can you use that information to improve your profitability. Normally, when I teach this course in a face-to-face settings, I would start with a question to the students about some things related to exchange rates. And I truly wish you were all here in one room so you could see each other's answers, compare them, and then we could discuss them. But for the sake of argument and illustration, let me still give you those questions and try to answer them first. Let's see if you know the answers, and then I'll discuss what answers I normally get and what they mean. So, for example, today, the British pound is worth $1.59. So for each 1 British pound, you would need to pay 1.59 American dollars. The question that I would like to ask is this: which currency is currently stronger based on the information provided? Can you answer that? I encourage you to take a piece of paper and write down your answer. Now, which country, the UK or the United States, has a higher cost of living? Can you answer that question provided on the, based on the information provided here on the screen? All right, again, write down your answer. Now, which economy is doing better currently based on the information provided? Write it down and let's talk about it. I don't know what you personally gave me as the answer, but I'm going to tell you what most students give me as an answer when I ask that question. And I ask it every single semester, and I normally have at least 100 students and sometimes more. Usually, the vast majority of the students say that the UK currency is stronger, the UK has a higher cost of living and is doing better. I would sometimes ask the same question with the Kuwaiti Dinar and American dollar. And so the Kuwaiti Dinar is 3 times as expensive as the American dollar. And I would see what people tell me. And then sometimes I would even ask them to compare the Kuwaiti Dinar to the UK, to the British pound. So basically compare the Kuwaiti economy to the British economy and ask them those same questions. And students make all kinds of inferences based on these numbers. The correct answer, however, is, brace for it, you absolutely cannot answer any of these questions based on the information provided. The information provided here is not sufficient, is pretty much useless in order to answer those questions or for answering those questions. It doesn't mean anything. For example, if I took the Japanese yen and compared it to the US dollar, the exchange rate would be the opposite way. For every American dollar, you would need to pay about 50 Japanese yen, right? And so it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that the Japanese economy is doing 50 times worse or is weaker or anything else. It's just the exchange rate. Same thing with just about any other currency. So it could be useful if I gave you these numbers, the exchange rate today and a year ago. Then yes, you would have some dynamics over time and you could make some inferences. But if I simply give you the exchange rate today, it doesn't mean anything. Just like, for example, 1 euro has 100 cents. It doesn't mean that 1 euro is stronger than 100 cents. It's just a scale, just a number, or $1 and 100 cents. If you changed and started counting everything in cents and said that this wonderful phone cost not $500, but 50,000 cents, it wouldn't really, it doesn't mean anything. It just basically, just a different scale. It doesn't mean that it became 100 times cheaper, right? So let me give you some illustrations here. So here are some graphs from the past. And the reason I like to use these graphs, even though it's been a few years, is because you could see a huge change during that short period of time. And so here you see a graph that illustrates the exchange rate between the American dollar and the British pound. And as you can see, if anything, the American dollar is actually becoming stronger and stronger. So at some point, the exchange rate was 2 to 1. and then it slid dramatically and it became 1.38 or so to 1. So if anything, the US dollar was in March of 2009 stronger compared to the British pound than it was just a few months ago. So it still costs less in a sense. You still have to pay more than $1 for 1 British pound, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of the strength of the economy or the cost of living. It's just a different scale. Same thing, for example, when you look at the Kuwaiti Dinar and the American dollar. Again, as you can see, the rate was roughly stable at about 3.75. And then if anything, the Kuwaiti Dinar became cheaper. And so over time, the American dollar became stronger compared to the Kuwaiti Dinar, even though the exchange rate remained 3.4, 3.5 at the time when I took this graph. And so while the Kuwaiti Dinar looks like it's 3 times more expensive, it doesn't tell you anything about the strength of the economy or the strength of the currency. As you can see, it can actually be the completely opposite to what you would infer from the kind of price of the dollar. Again, imagine that, for example, the United States decided to do a reform of its monetary policy and, I don't know, remove a zero from all dollars. So make everything 10 times smaller in terms of the number of dollars. So $10 becomes 1, 1,000 becomes 100. So tomorrow you would have new banknotes and they would have fewer zeros, but it doesn't mean that the things would become more expensive or more cheap. You would just be paying $1 new for what you used to pay 10 old dollars. But the American economy wouldn't change, the cost of living wouldn't change, just the scale would change. So everything would be divided by 10, but not in terms of, actual tangible differences. It's just the scale, just a different currency, right? So for example, if euro is $1.2 today, right? And you have to buy, let's say, for example, I don't know, this mouse you could buy it for $10, or you can buy it for, let's say, 8 euros. It's not less expensive or more expensive in euros. It's just the exchange rate, and so it doesn't tell you anything unless you have more information. I hope you understand that, because this is a foundation for this lecture as well as for you as business students. Now, one of the reasons many people get confused is because of the terminology that is widely used and improperly used. The terminology is very misleading. So if I can teach you anything about exchange rates and international monetary systems, this is this slide here, these terms. If you can understand this stuff, you pretty much don't need to know, well, you need to know much more, but you can infer everything else from these terms. So try to understand what I'm trying to say here now. The problem, or the reason why many people do not understand how currency exchanges work or currency exchange rates work, is because the media, the public, use what, in my opinion, are not only wrong terms, but misleading terms. People like to refer to currencies as strong and weak. So, for example, a dollar is a strong currency. Euro is a strong currency. But, for example, Russian ruble is a weak currency. And that is not correct. The problem here is that strong and weak, they kind of have this emotional meaning. So strong is good, weak is bad, right? So we kind of don't like weak and we like strong. But when we talk about currencies, we really don't talk about strength. We talk about overpriced or underpriced, right? Or perhaps stable and volatile. So for example, one of the reasons why the American dollar is called strong, it's not because it's really strong or hard, as some say. It's because it's stable over time. Its price doesn't change much, doesn't drop much, likewise doesn't really increase much, or at least not so much as price of other currencies. Why, for example, Russian ruble is often called weak currency is because it fluctuates a lot. It's, sometimes expensive, sometimes cheap, sometimes it can change value in a matter of day to a degree of 4 or 5%. In fact, that's what's been happening lately. And so it's less stable as opposed to weak. Okay? So when we use the term stable and volatile, we understand what that means. But when we say strong and weak, we use those emotionally charged terms that are not really applicable here. Sometimes when people say strong or weak, what they really mean is overpriced and underpriced. And that's another very important distinction. Yes, dollar sometimes is strong, like it is now. So now dollar is more expensive than it was a few months ago. And many people call it strong, and strong sounds good. Oh yes, see, America is doing something right, the dollar is strong. But actually it has a negative effect on the economy. In fact, a very negative effect on the economy, and we'll talk about that later. And the reason people cannot understand it, because the term strong sounds so good. I mean, strong, hard, how could it be bad? Well, try to use a more precise economic term, which is overpriced. So the American dollar is overpriced today. Now all of a sudden you understand that something's wrong here. If a product is too expensive, all of a sudden the product becomes, it's a bad thing. Like for example, the cell phone, if it's $500, imagine that it's overpriced and I'm trying to sell it for $1,000. You would call me crazy, you would not buy it from me. And you would see how by overpricing my product, I can put myself in a situation where I'm not economically better off. That's the same thing with the dollar. If it's overpriced, strong, whatever it means, right? Overpriced, too expensive. All of a sudden, people have a difficult time buying American dollars. As a result, they have a difficult time buying American products. So it's bad for the economy. The opposite is true for the euro now. So the euro is weak, right? The euro has lost its value. So it used to be 1.5 to the American dollar. Then it was like 1.3, 1.2 for a long time. Today it's almost 1 to 1. So something like 1.02 last time I checked. And it seems like euro is weak. But if you use the more precise, more accurate term, underpriced, it actually looks not so bad. The euro is underpriced. Buying euro is cheap. Buying products from Europe, from the European Union with the cheap euro becomes easier. So it makes easier to buy European products. It makes easier to sell European products. It actually stimulates the European economy. So it's not as bad as people present it. So instead of using the terms strong and weak, try to use either overpriced or underpriced, whichever applies, and stable and volatile. So if you use those terms, not only will you be more precise in your speech, in your definitions, but also you will send the right signal, because when people say strong and weak, or when they talk about the soft and strong currency, and hard currency, those are not exactly precise terms, and sometimes may actually have a positive emotional charge, but have a negative economic effect on the economy. Now, here is another test that I would like to ask you, just to see if you know the answers. And I'll be honest with you, most of my students don't know those answers at the beginning of the class. One of the things that I would like to say about this topic is that unlike the other topics that we cover in this course, this one seems so familiar. Exchange rates. Of course I know. Why would I be, preparing for the test? I know what an exchange rate is. I know that currencies exist. They have different exchange rates. I know how to calculate them, so I must get an A+ for this course. No, there is much more to this course than just knowing that currencies exist and that they have exchange rates. You need to know more. And so when I ask for more, in many cases, my students cannot answer those questions. So let me give you some basic questions that you will know how to answer by the end of this lecture, but let's know if you know how to answer them now. For example, currency exchange rates fluctuations are primarily affected by different levels of inflation in different countries. Is that true or false? In other words, is inflation the main factor that affects exchange rates? Is inflation the reason why sometimes American dollar is 1 to 1 with the Canadian dollar, and sometimes, as it is today, it's 72 cents Canadian dollars to 1 American dollar, right? So is that because of the inflation differences in inflation in the two countries, or it's something else? Now, most of my students choose A. They do believe that inflation matters. And the truth is that no, it's not the main reason. It could be a reason, yes, if the country is going through a dramatic shift, dramatic inflation level. Like, for example, when you look at Ukraine or Russia today, the inflation there is huge. There are all kinds of things going on in the countries, and we'll discuss them later. But the inflation is huge. So we're talking about like 200% inflation, probably even 300% inflation in the matter of the last year, or rather even half a year. And so when you have something like that, yes, obviously it will have an effect on exchange rate. It's not really the inflation per se that affects the exchange rate. There is something else that is going on. Like, for example, in Ukraine, it appears that the money is being printed on a large scale. And so the printing of the money affects the inflation, increases the inflation, but at the same time also changes the exchange rate. And so in a sense, yes, inflation in this case is kind of not necessarily the cause, but at least they go together, right? But in most cases, that is not the case. For example, when you look at the European currency and American currency, or better yet, Canadian and American currency, in all of these regions that I just named, the exchange rates have been relatively stable over the last century or so. In Europe, in America, in Canada, the inflation rate has been historically anywhere between 2 and 5%. Hardly ever was it below 2, hardly ever was it above 4 actually. So, and in most cases they were going together. So if it was a little more than 3 in one country, chances are it was a little more in other countries, and vice versa. So when you see a change in exchange rate of the US dollar to the Canadian dollar at the magnitude of about 30% in a matter of a few months, it's definitely not inflation, because there was no noticeable difference in inflation rates in these two countries over this period. So as I said, sometimes inflation could be correlated with exchange rates, but in many cases it's weak, it's almost zero, and it's much weaker and much slower than other much more important processes. So inflation could be a reason, but in most cases it's not. Now, here is another question. The price of one Big Mac, McDonald's Big Mac, is, let's say, $3 in the US and 9 yuan in China. The question is, where does one Big Mac cost more? Write it down for yourself. So $3 in America, 9 yuan in China. Where does one Big Mac cost more? Again, usually many of my students make a mistake and they say, well, it's probably more expensive in the US or maybe in China. And the answer is, we cannot tell. Unless we know the exchange rate, we can't really tell, right? Now, why do some products have different prices in different countries? So, for example, Big Mac, yes, it does have a different price in different markets. Why are they different? And I'm going to ask you to write down your answers here, but we'll get to this question later on. There are all kinds of reasons that you probably didn't think about. And so usually I get at least a few good answers to this one. Again, not everyone can answer or give me a complete list, but at least, I get something. And we'll get to the exhaustive list a little later. Is it possible to predict exchange rates, and how? This is where my students get puzzled and they say, you probably could, but it's difficult. And they don't really know how to predict exchange rates. And again, that's what we'll discuss in today's class. So how would you predict exchange rates? Well, let's talk about that in a second. Let's first take a look at the history, all right? So let's talk about how we ended up with different currencies and how money has worked over time, right? So you probably all know that in prehistoric time, there was no money, right? People would exchange goods for goods. So there would be some sort of counter trade agreements in place. So you would basically have barter. Like, for example, I don't know, I have 2 apples and you have 3 fish, and I'm willing to exchange my 2 apples for 1 fish or something like that. And so there would be no money. Then soon enough, people came up with the concept of money, and all kinds of things have been used as money, from berries to precious metals to bones of different animals. All kinds of things have been used as a standard of exchange, right? At some point, gold emerged as a standard, international standard for exchanging goods, and several reasons for gold or the reasons for choosing gold as a standard for exchange are: 1, it's scarce; So it's kind of in a limited supply or almost in a fixed supply. And so yes, it is true that sometimes we would find big deposits of gold, and so the supply of gold increases, but usually it's not a dramatic change. So the supply of gold has been staying relatively stable and increasing relatively steadily over time. Second, and that's very important, the gold is very resistant to corrosion, to chemical reactions, and so it's a very stable element, and it preserves itself very well. So you can have gold buried in the ground and it will stay there for a century. You dig it up and it's as good as new. So it's not reacting with most products. But then again, as you know, the gold standard has been used for about 300 years, from the 1700s up until about 50 years or 70 years ago. But then most countries abandoned the gold standard in around the Second World War. And many people don't know, first, why that was done. And second, many people believe that the gold standard was actually a very good idea. See, when we had the gold standard, we didn't have inflation, right? Or not noticeable inflation. So the money, the dollars, like for example, if you look at the dollar bill, it literally would say, it's redeemable or exchangeable for a certain amount of gold, like for an ounce of gold or something like that, right? And people like that because you could always take that piece of paper that represented a certain amount of gold, go to a central bank and say, well, I want my gold. And so for that piece of paper, you would get the gold. In fact, that's how we got the paper money. Because while we had the gold standard, carrying gold around was always, not very convenient. It's a very heavy element, very heavy metal, and you don't want to carry it around because, you can not only lose it, but it's inconvenient, right? So what people started doing is they started paying or putting that gold in banks, right? And when they were putting the money in banks, the bank would literally take a piece of paper and write, John Smith deposited, let's say, 1 pound of gold. And so here's a piece of paper that confirms that he has 1 pound of gold in our bank. And so if John Smith will ever come back and brings this piece of paper, the banker would look at it and say, oh yeah, we have that. So thank you very much for your piece of paper. Here is your gold back. And then as the banks started working with one another, John Smith could go to any other bank and say, well, here is my certificate that I have so much gold in bank ABC, or whatever the name, XYZ. And so he would give that piece of paper to another bank, and the another bank will look, oh yeah, he has the gold in the different bank, so we will take that and give him the gold back so that we can later take this piece of paper to the original bank and get our gold back. And then eventually people started trading those pieces of paper, and as you know, that's how money was created. And for a long, long time, even when the money was printed without the actual exchange of, gold going from one hand into another, we would still use the pieces of paper that would say, this piece of paper represents so much gold. But then about 60, 70 years ago, most countries abandoned gold standard, and there was a good reason for that. The biggest reason was that, one, the gold is in limited supply. And you basically had a situation where the economies were growing much faster than the supply of gold. And so what you ended up with was this. Imagine that you have a country and you have, let's say that country has 100 kilograms of gold, right? And imagine that that country makes, let's say, 100 cars a year, and they don't make anything else, only cars, right? So in this case, each kilogram of gold would represent 1 car, so because that's the only good that is traded in the country. And so the price of a car basically becomes 1 kilogram of gold, because the money that you, or the products that you have, that money represents, that's 100 cars. Then over time, the country starts making more and more cars, and now it has better technologies and better, productivity, and it can make 500 cars, right? But you still have only 1 kilogram of gold. So all of a sudden, you have basically a deflation. So 1 kilogram of gold now can buy 5 cars. And so that creates a problem, because your money is basically becoming more and more expensive over time. And that's a problem, because people don't want to invest that money in anything. Why would you invest your gold in any enterprise, stimulate the economy, when you can just hold it in your pocket and wait and see how it increases in value as the economy grows? And so the government couldn't just keep up with the supply of, couldn't keep up the supply of gold with the growth in the economy. And that led to huge deflation and created all kinds of other economic problems. And that's a problem. You want your money to be more or less, the prices to be more or less stable. And you want the supply of money to more or less increase at the same rate as the economy increases. And you cannot do that with gold because you can't just, print new gold. You have to find it, which is often impossible. Another big problem is that there is this theory, and it's been supported many times. In fact, when you look at the United States today, like literally in 2015, you can see the attestment to that theory. And the theory says that when the times are bad, it's the government's responsibility to stimulate the demand, to stimulate the economy. And so normally the way it's done is the government would spend money on all kinds of projects, usually infrastructure projects. Like, for example, in Germany, after the Second World War, the country was destroyed and there was this Marshall Plan in place where the government spent money on building the infrastructure, mainly roads, highways. And so the government would literally print the money. Well, in the case with the Marshall Plan, the money was given by other countries, but in a sense it was printed first. And so that influx of money created the demand for particular goods and services. And so that allowed the government to put all the people to work quickly. So here's the money, please do the work, I'll pay you. And so while it was kind of cheating in a sense, because part of that money just appeared from nowhere, was just printed, but that created that initial push, that initial demand, so that the economy started working, and then more people would work, more goods are created. Those who work on creating those goods receive the salaries, so they would spend the money on something else, on food, on clothing, on whatever else, and that created that multiplicator effect. And so soon enough, everybody was working, everybody was doing things. If the government had stuck with the gold standard, the government couldn't just create demand for stuff, because the only way you could do it is by paying in gold. And you may not have enough gold to kickstart the economy. And so the government believes, and many economists concur with that, going all the way back to Keynes, that the government should be able to vary the supply of money in the economy. If the economy is not doing well, the government should be able to provide influx of money into the economy so that there is more demand and there is more movement. At the same time, sometimes it is believed that when the economy is growing too fast, if there is this what we call overheating of the economy, the government may actually reduce the supply of money. So basically take some money from the circulation. And again, that's easier done when the money is paper or electronic. And yes, we know that it's not always working as good as as it does in theory. We know that some governments cannot resist the temptation and start printing money right and left, and that leads to more problems than it solves. But at least sometimes, especially when the government does it responsibly, being able to vary the supply of money is a very big instrument, very strong instrument for stimulating the economy. And the reason I mentioned the United States in this context is because we have a very nice natural experiment where in the, with the crisis of the 2008 struck, and then 2009 got even worse, different countries use different approaches. And so Europe, interestingly, the socialist Europe, took a very capitalist approach, and they basically cut the spending and tried to implement all kinds of austerity measures, trying to make sure that, if we don't have the money for this, we're not going to make this. And as a result, the European economy actually struggled for a while, and still today in 2015, still not doing very well. I mean, it's improving overall, but it's still not out of recession as we would like it to be. The United States, the capitalist United States, took a much more socialist approach in a sense. The United States used government spending to stimulate the economy. There were all kinds of bailout packages, stimulus packages, quantitative easing, which in many cases were literally just printing money and sending them into the economy. They didn't quite print money per se, but they were finding ways to increase the circulation of money, of financial instruments in the economy, and thereby creating demand for services and goods and stimulating the economy that way. And it looks like the American economy is doing much better now than, for example, its European counterpart. So if anything, that seems to have worked very well. And so the abandonment of the gold standard gave the countries that opportunity, that way of being more flexible, as well as staying in touch with both the economic growth, but also when needed trying to stimulate that economic growth, or sometimes maybe even kind of stop it a little bit when it's growing too fast, slow it down a little bit when it's going too uncomfortably fast. Now, why do exchange rates change? Again, before we get and talk about the whys, let me give you some background. The thing is, and it's very important, again, if you understand this graph that you see on the slide here, you will know a lot about the exchange rates. You will know pretty much almost all that there is to know. And the big reason exchange rates change dramatically from time to time is that because wealth exists in different forms. So when a person or country or an individual is wealthy, they have one of the three. They can have money, so they could have those pieces of paper that represent wealth. So you can have a lot of, let's say, dollars or a lot of euros, and then you are wealthy. Or you can have instead shares. And by shares, I mean, broadly speaking. So it could be all kinds of financial instruments that could be freely traded. Bonds, stocks, all kinds of other stuff. So financial papers or instruments that represent tangible wealth, usually, let's say, companies or debt, right? And so again, I can be very wealthy without having a single dollar, but having a lot of shares of companies or, all kinds of other, financial securities. Or third option, you can be wealthy by having all kinds of real estate and goods. For example, I can have no shares, no dollars, but own, let's say, 25 houses. And then I'm rich. I don't have any money at the moment, but I do have some tangible property. It can also be goods like, cell phones, like cars, like whatever else. Again, if I had 10,000 of these, for example, or 20,000 of these, I wouldn't have any money or any shares, but I could sell my cell phones and thereby acquire other forms of wealth. And so it doesn't matter what type of wealth you have, money, financial instruments, or tangible goods. Whatever you have, that's wealth. And the exchange rates often change when the value of one of them changes. For example, going back to the rapid increase in value of the American dollar in 2009. I showed you the graphs at the beginning of the slide of the lecture. You remember very rapidly, the US dollar gained about 30% in value compared to all other currencies. So, for example, with the Canadian dollar, the US dollar was actually cheaper than the Canadian dollar was. And then literally, fall of 2008, boom, the American dollar became much more expensive. I'll talk a little later about why it had an impact on me personally, but just remember that happened. Likewise, for example, you could see that some currencies fluctuate rapidly today, especially in Eastern Europe and especially, again, dollar. But let's go back to 2009. You all remember that the dollar shoot up in value almost overnight. The reason I vividly remember those days is because that was the time when I had already signed my contract with the University of North Carolina in Greensboro here, so where I still work. And I was at that time still working and studying in Canada. So I was a doctoral student and I graduated in 2008, and I was getting ready to go to the United States to take this job here. As a student, I was teaching and I did accumulate some money. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to eventually here buy a townhouse. So let's say I had about $100,000. Actually, it was a little less, but it was a sizable amount of money, right? And so I'm getting ready to leave and I have some, tens of thousands of dollars. Not a huge amount, but still a very huge amount for me at that time. And the exchange rate was roughly 1-to-1, the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. It was actually even the case that the Canadian dollar was slightly more expensive. So it was like 1.05 American dollars for one Canadian dollar. And I feel kind of rich, I have money to buy stuff in America. And then boom, fall of 2008, American economy tanks. And for some reason, the American dollar becomes much more expensive. And all of a sudden, for each dollar Canadian that I have, I no longer can buy one American dollar. I can buy only about 70 cents. The change was drastic. I mean, literally, Canadian dollar dropped to about 72 cents. Like, boom, big deal. And so I relocated to the United States, and I didn't feel comfortable changing my currency at that low rate. And so I'm here renting a house for the first few months, trying to buy a house. And the problem is that I have enough Canadian dollars in Canadian dollars to buy a house, if that was, that kind of one-to-one exchange rate. But all of a sudden, I'm losing about $20,000. Actually, it was more like $25,000 on that amount because of the exchange rate that just changed. And so I waited for almost a year before the exchange rate stabilized. And when I bought my house, I exchanged my Canadian dollars for 94 cents American dollars. So it dropped to about 70 cents, and then it went up and it reached about 94 cents at the day when I changed my currency. And at that time, it was just enough to buy a house here. It was a townhouse, so it wasn't like a big house. It was just a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom townhouse. And I believe I even had to borrow like $3,000 or something like that for 2 weeks from my bank to have enough for closing. And then I got my salary, so I kind of paid that back in a couple of weeks. So the question becomes, why did the American dollar become so expensive in a matter of a few weeks? Many students would say, well, American economy must have, strengthened rapidly. And no, actually, that was the opposite. The American economy went down, but that's where the crisis started. As you know, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and then Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the big companies that kind of manage the real estate in the United States, almost went bankrupt and needed all kinds of stimulus and bailout packages. So actually, that was the time when we pretty much had the next Great Depression, the second Great Depression in the United States. So if anything, the American economy was doing extremely poorly and much worse than in other countries. So why did the American dollar become so expensive? Well, the reason is on this diagram right here. So the reason is that one form of shares or wealth became overnight basically lost a lot of its value. And so in that case, it was actually two forms of wealth. So we had real estate and we had shares. So in 2008, up until 2008, in the United States, there was this belief that housing is always a good investment. And so housing prices were growing at the rate of 5 to 10% annually, pretty much since the 90s, since the Bill Clinton's era. And so people would invest in housing in hopes that the prices will continue to grow, and it's a safe investment. You can always sell the house, right? It's right there, you control it. And so prices went up too much, and too many people were given loans, mortgages to buy houses, people who couldn't pay them back. And so in 2008, in the fall, that's when finally people realized, first, our housing is not as expensive as we think it is. So the houses that we have may not be worth as much as we think they are. And all of a sudden, the price of real estate drops dramatically. So there is this bubble and it bursts and prices go down. And then when that burst, people realize, well, maybe the economy is in trouble. And so maybe investing in American shares is not a good idea. And so everybody starts selling American shares. And so here you have a situation where everybody's trying to sell American houses and everybody's trying to sell American shares, American companies. And when people are selling them, so what is a sale? What is the trade? That's an exchange of one type of wealth for another, an exchange of a cell phone for $1 or for another cell phone or a house for money. And so when people were trying to sell their houses that they invested in America or their companies that they invested in America, what they were doing is basically they were trying to exchange those forms of wealth for American dollar, right? So all of a sudden everybody wanted to get American dollars and were willing to give whatever shares or whatever property they had for those dollars. And so the demand for the green part of the wealth increased dramatically, and everybody was trying to exchange the blue and the orange parts of wealth for the green part of wealth. And so when everybody was trying to buy dollars, obviously the price went up. But it was not because the economy was doing good. It was because the economy was actually doing bad. So it's just because everybody was trying to exchange whatever wealth they had for dollars, because that was the American currency, so that's how you sell it. So that's why the prices went up. And then eventually, when people either didn't have anything else to sell, or prices of shares and houses fell so low that you didn't really need to have many dollars to do the exchange, the price of dollars started stabilizing, and then eventually when the economy started recovering, it actually went back up. And here is a slide if you will be reading the slides before preparing for the exam, or as you are preparing for the exam. That's what I just said, but in my own words. So, what affects exchange rates? Well, as I said, it could be a number of factors, and in the long run, yes, it's economic forces. It could be like long-term inflation, it could be like economic growth, or availability or demand for resources. And I'll give you a few examples in a few minutes. But in the short run, it's often just people willing to buy or sell that currency. So either trying to buy some sort of goods in that country and they need that currency, so the demand for the currency increases, or people trying to sell certain goods within the country, and so they're dropping the price of basically increasing the supply of the good, but also decreasing the supply or increasing the demand for the dollars or whatever currency you use. And as a result, that may affect the exchange rate. Financial markets like stocks, fiscal policy, so central bank may increase the interest rates or decrease the interest rates. So we'll talk about those one by one. So for example, let's take a look at the exchange rate of the American dollar versus the Canadian dollar. And so this actually illustrates the exchange rates of American dollar compared to many other countries. So for example, here you have a number of very drastic drops. For example, in 2008, as we discussed, the Canadian dollar became much cheaper compared to the American dollar, or in other words, American dollar became much more expensive. And the reason for that is, as we discussed, everybody was trying to sell American wealth in terms of houses or shares. And so there was a huge demand for American dollar, and all of a sudden it became very expensive. So the Canadian dollar compared to the American dollar dropped dramatically, right? Then the American economy started normalizing, and the Canadian economy was doing better than American. So the Canadian dollar started gaining value. And as you see, it's not overnight like it was here. It's a slow, steady process. Then in 2012, American economy started doing better and better and better. And at the same time, the price of oil started slowly dropping and dropping and dropping. And so as a result, the Canadian dollar started sliding in value compared to the American dollar again. And as you can see, so while the Canadian dollar was much more expensive than American dollar at some time, it started going down and down and down, and is about 80 cents for one American dollar today. So you can see here both dramatic changes and rapid changes. Here, for example, when you look at this one last drop, again, it was pretty dramatic. I mean, we're talking about a change from roughly almost 90 cents to almost 80 cents, so like a 10% drop in a matter of a few weeks. And especially this last one, it was a rapid drop. And that was when the price of oil went down dramatically, and in the Canadian import structure, oil corresponds to quite a few, I believe it's 6% of the economy. And so as a result, the lower price of oil meant that now you need fewer Canadian dollars to buy Canadian oil. And so as a result, the demand for Canadian dollar went down, so the price of Canadian dollar went down as well. And when you look at the Russian ruble, that sort of trend is even more obvious. Here I have a graph that illustrates the relationship or the dynamics of the exchange rate of the Russian ruble against all major currencies versus the price of oil on the international markets. And as you can see, the two graphs are almost identical. So oil represents a huge portion of the Russian economy, as Joe Biden recently said, not Joe Biden, sorry, McCain, right? So as McCain recently said, John McCain, Russia is basically a big gas station. And of course it's an exaggeration, but in Russian economy, oil and gas represent a huge portion of the economy. And when you look at the revenues of the budget from the oil dollars and gas dollars, and the two prices are very closely related. Something like 40% of the entire budget are basically thanks to the natural resources sales. And so if you've been following the global developments, you know that price of oil has been fluctuating dramatically. So for example, in 2008, price of oil was, in the beginning of the year, it was roughly $130 per barrel, and it went down to something like $40 per barrel. In fact, you see that drop here on the graph. And as you can see, right after that, so once the price of oil started dropping, right after that, like literally weeks later, the price of Russian ruble started going down again. And you see that same situation here today. So for example, as of early 2015, and I don't have that particular part on the graph, the price of oil went down to about $50 per barrel. It was actually 38, I believe, the lowest a few weeks ago. Then it went down to up to about 40, and as of today, it's about $50 per barrel. And the same thing happened to the Russian ruble. So it was roughly 30 to 1 with the American dollar, and it was stable 30 to 1 with the American dollar for quite some time. But when the price of oil went down from 130 to 40, the Russian ruble lost half of its value, actually more than half. So there were days when it reached $70 rubles for $1. Again, today it's about 57, so the price of oil started going up a little bit, and so the price of Russian ruble went up as well. So, but as you can see, the two are very, very closely related, and so here you basically have a situation where what represents, so the money represents a certain amount of barrels of oil in a sense in Russia, as well as other products, but oil is a big component of it. And as you can see, it's basically the same graph. The only difference here is that the price of oil fluctuates more than the price of ruble, but that makes sense because, again, ruble is not only oil. I mean, Russian economy produces other types of things. But again, to the extent that oil and gas are roughly almost half of all Russian economy. Again, it's not exactly half as part of the GDP, but it's almost half as far as exports, as far as government revenues. So you understand why that's roughly the type of changes you see here. So for every dollar change in the oil price of oil, you kind of see like a 50-cent change in the price of Russian ruble. Now, so is strong or weak better for the country? I'm going to show you a short video here that illustrates why sometimes weak is good.
It may be autumn outside this Brooklyn manufacturing complex, but inside it's feeling a bit like spring. Demand at Lee Spring, a New York City-based manufacturer since 1918, is bouncing back. Since July, it's seen orders pick up from a wide range of industries, including aerospace, defense, medical, and clean technologies. Helping drive business, rising demand from overseas.
We're seeing a lot of growth into Europe. We're also seeing growth into Mexico, and Canada has been a real highlight of us lately. We're seeing good, strong growth into Canada, and we're seeing growth into the Far East.
During the height of the economic crisis, Lee saw orders plunge more than 20% from normal levels. They're still off about 10%. But Lee hopes to see positive growth next year. One big reason, the weaker dollar, which is helping boost exports.
Sales in certain areas into certain regions where we've been helped by the exchange rate are growing in double digits right now. And that's a big turnaround from the way it was 9 months ago or so when the dollar was moving in the other direction.
Over the past year, the U.S. dollar has dropped 12% against major world currencies. For Lee and other U.S. manufacturers, a weaker dollar means U.S. products are cheaper to buy overseas. Thanks in part to this trend, overall U.S. exports rose at an annual rate of more than 14% over the summer.
This is a torsion spring.
Lee's global marketing director, Helene Herman, says the weaker dollar could persuade overseas buyers to think again about buying American.
A weak dollar may encourage people who might look at buying a product domestically to look at an American-made product because they're getting more than just the dollar. They're also getting the ingenuity, the engineering expertise, the consistency of materials.
Herman says many small manufacturers she talks to are ready to take even greater advantage of the weak dollar and expand exports, but are being held back by banks reluctant to lend. Despite the challenges, trends may be looking up.
Lee Spring is a good barometer for the economy as a whole because we're so broad-based. And we've certainly seen growth over the last quarter, and we look from what we're reading from our customers that we'll see growth in the next quarter and in 2010.
Business strength benefiting from currency weakness. Maggie Lake, CNN, Brooklyn, New York.
So this news report was from 2010, from the time when the American dollar became cheaper, underpriced, weak. So in 2008 and 2009, as we discussed, the American dollar became very overpriced, about 30-40% more expensive than it just was a few months ago. But then in 2010 or so, we saw a different trend where the US dollar started going down rapidly. And so that's when the dollar was weak, and that's when the report was recorded and aired. And as you can see here in the report, they talked about how the cheaper the dollar, the easier it is to buy American products and the better it is for American industry. Today we again see in 2015, early 2015, we see a situation where the American dollar is overpriced. And again, it's strong, as many people call it. And that's the time when, again, buying American products is becoming more expensive, and more foreign buyers prefer to buy, for example, European products, which are currently cheaper because of the cheaper euro. And so sometimes, as you can see, the softness, the weakness of the currency may actually be a good thing for the economy, and vice versa. The strong currency could be a negative thing for the economy. I'll give you another example of how, I shouldn't use the term weak and strong. I told you that, they are bad. And the reason I use them is just to kind of illustrate the point one more time. So for example, Dell, as well as many other electronics manufacturers, are known for building factories in countries that have volatile, unstable, weak currencies. For example, Dell has a number of factories in the Philippines, right? And the Philippines have historically had a weak or volatile currency, so the currency that always changes in value and usually loses its value, so becoming cheaper and cheaper. Now Dell makes its products in the country with the weak currency, but as you can imagine, sells them all around the world, in America, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere. And so by having a factory where labor is paid in local currency and the currency is losing value all the time, Dell basically saves money, improves its profits. Dell is able to pay to people in an ever cheaper currency while selling its products for an ever more expensive currency of the European Union, of America, Canada, and so on. So it's perfectly legal. There is nothing wrong with that. Just because the currency always gets cheaper and cheaper, it's better to do business there. So if you ever wanted to open a business and you don't really care where you are, and if your business is sold internationally, it may be a good idea to go to a country that is known for a sliding value of its currency, so currency that is becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper all the time, because all of a sudden for $1 you can hire people for more time. So for example, if you have business in Russia today where the currency lost half of its value in a matter of a few months, you would still be paying in rubles. But if you sell your product for dollars, all of a sudden for one employee, you used to pay, let's say, for example, $20 a day, right? So which used to be, 1,000 rubles. Today it would still be 1,000 rubles, but all of a sudden you can buy that with only $10. And I'm not calculating the exact exchange rates, but you understand the logic behind that policy. Now, again, if you're still not convinced that weak currency sometimes is good for the economy, and vice versa, strong currency sometimes may have a detrimental effect on the economy, here are again some highlights or some extracts from the newspapers of 2009, and I took those on April 29. And the reason I chose that date and the reason I copied them at that time is because that's when the US dollar was very strong. That's when it went up very, very rapidly. And as you can see, you have all kinds of headers here, all kinds of titles here that say that weak is bad, is good, but strong is bad. And so that was the problem that happened in the US at that time. So same thing here. You can read them at your leisure, but I'm just saying that, so. Well, the big question then becomes, if weak or underpriced currency is so good for the economy, why not keep it artificially weak? Why not just, keep it weaker so that people are willing to buy your products? There are two reasons for that. And the answer to that question depends on the answer to the question, how can you keep your currency weak? What can you do to keep your currency underpriced? And it turns out that you don't really have many instruments. And one of them would be print more currency. It will lose in value and it will make it easier for foreigners to buy your products, which kind of makes sense, but then inflation kicks in. And usually the problems associated with inflation are much greater than the problems associated with imports and exports. And so you can't really print currency. What you can do also on top of that, you can artificially kind of increase supply of your currency and decrease supply of foreign currencies. And that's what China allegedly does. As you may have heard, China keeps its currency yuan artificially cheap, and presumably that makes Chinese imports, Chinese products more attractive to foreigners, to people in the European Union, in America. And so that's why more and more consumers and traders buy products from China and not from Europe or the United States. And so allegedly China manipulates its currency and makes it more difficult for European and American businesses that have stronger currencies to compete with China. And it may be true. And the way China does it is it accumulates huge reserves of foreign currencies. So when China sells its products to America, for example, or to Europe, technically what should happen at that point, the American consumers paid for these with dollars, and then the dollars presumably should come to China, and China should exchange it for yuans, and thereby, basically use the dollars, sell them, reduce the value of dollar, increase the value of yuan, because you would create demand for yuan. And allegedly what China does, it never does the exchange. So it just basically accumulates huge reserves of foreign currencies, of euro, of dollar, of other currencies. And by doing so, they effectively create demand for those foreign currencies, but reduce demand for Chinese yuan. And that could work, and it could be the case that that's how China stimulates demand for its products. But it's a very expensive policy. The truth is that not many countries can do that, because you literally have to take a lot of foreign dollars, buy them, and just sit on them, just basically keep them. And not many countries can do it. So it may be an effective policy in the short run, but it requires freezing up a lot of resources, and many countries cannot do that. In the long run, it may not be such a good policy after all, because first, what if, let's say, you accumulated a lot of dollars and then dollars will lose its value? If that happened, obviously that would be a problem for you, because you made all those products, you delivered all those products, and then it turns out that you worked for free, right? Second, again, money is not the goal. You understand that, right? Working for somebody else is not a goal. You want to have something in exchange. But so far what we've seen with China is that China works a lot for us, for people in North America and Europe, and sends a lot of products. And we basically, in exchange, promise to pay or give pieces of paper that presumably represent something. But in reality, what we've seen over the last 20 years is that the Chinese people did more for American people than American people did for the Chinese people. So there were more products going from China to America than from America to China. And yes, that resulted in a situation where Americans kind of owe a lot to Chinese. But again, will they pay back or not? Probably they will. But again, China is kind of risking more here. And if something goes wrong in America, China may never get that money back. If as I said, huge inflation or some sort of other problems, or if America defaults on its debt. So it's a risky game. You can kind of stimulate your own production, but you may not get as much in return as you hoped for. And so here is a question for you that I'd like you to answer, likely to appear on the exam. Let's see if you know the answer. And the answer clearly is D, the country improves its profits. So when we talk about prediction methods for predicting exchange rates, there are two basic fundamental approaches. There is what we call fundamental analysis, and there is what we call technical analysis. Fundamental analysis is basically a look at fundamental economic factors, such as productivity, such as unemployment, such as price of the commodities, if the country depends on commodities, things like that, inflation. Technical analysis, on the other hand, is something that is based solely on, let's call it, statistical models. So those literally would be just some technical correlations that over time have been shown to predict certain swings in the currency exchange rates. So it could be things like, for example, there is a meeting between, let's say, Angela Merkel of Germany and let's say Russian President Vladimir Putin. And so people would literally try to rate mood of Angela Merkel after the meeting and correlate that or use that to predict the exchange rate of Russian ruble. And there may be some theories as to why there should be a correlation. Things like if she's unhappy, that probably means that there was no agreement reached on the 2015 conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which means the conflict will escalate and there will be more involvement of Russia into the conflict, which will lead to, more expenses from the Russian budget, which will in turn lead to lower exchange rate of the ruble, things like that. And so, but in this case, it's not really important what the correlation is or why there is a correlation, why there is a causality. It's more about looking at all those possible factors and literally just empirically testing and finding the ones that predict the exchange rates. And so fundamental analysis has its place. It works very well in the long run, actually quite accurate in the long run. But technical analysis seems to work better for the short run. And again, even though sometimes there would be all kinds of variables in the model and sometimes they would make no theoretical sense, but if the model works, after tests, we know it predicts it, so what? It's just purely technical analysis. Now, also when we look at the exchange rates of currencies, you would frequently see speculative forces at work. Remember those graphs that we looked at, how the exchange rate changes dramatically from day to day, even sometimes from hour to hour. You understand that fundamentally nothing has really changed in the economy of the country. It's not like the productivity of the country is changing from hour to hour, or inflation is changing from hour to hour. Yet you would see those kinds of changes in the currency. And the reason for that is that many people make a living by buying and selling currencies, and there are a lot of speculative games going on. So people buy certain currencies in hopes that their value will increase or exchange rate will increase, in hopes that they will be able to sell it later on for a profit. And vice versa, people sometimes sell the currency not because they don't need it anymore, but because they're afraid that the currency will further lose its value and they're afraid to lose. And so when you look at this graph behind me here, you see that the actual trend is usually fairly smooth as far as the fundamental real value of the currency. But as the value increases, there would be always people who would buy that currency for speculative reasons, just hoping that the price will keep going up. And so they overbuy, and at some point the price that people are willing to pay is actually higher than what it should be based on the economic factors. And then at some point people realize that now the price is higher than what it should be, and they start selling the currency. And then everybody understands that everybody will start offloading their currency because of that trend, and so they start selling, and they oversell. They sell the currency for much less than it's actually worth because they know everybody's trying to sell. And so you kind of have that dip, and then the whole process continues. And so while the actual underlying trend should be a fairly smooth line, the trading, as you will see, goes up and down, and in many cases, as I said, overpriced or underpriced prices are not an exception. Now, switching gears, let's talk about something completely different. It's related to currency exchange rates, but it's more deeper than that. And that's what we call the law of one price. The law of one price says that In a free, pure market, the price for an identical product should be identical in every location. Because if it was higher somewhere, then it would be bought where it's cheaper and sold where it's higher for profit. And so eventually everything will equalize itself, and so eventually the price will be the same in every location. Now we know that is not true, right? We know that when we go and, for example, buy a McDonald's, not a McDonald's, like an ice cream or hot dog, let's say in Manhattan versus in some small village in, I don't know, either Europe somewhere or America or China, a roughly identical product, or sometimes a purely identical product, will cost different price. Same thing, like the same car of the same make can cost different things in different locations. The computer of the same make may cost different amount of money in different locations. The question becomes why does that happen? And this is where I encourage you to pause and think and provide your answers. List at least 5. Now, I hope you did pause, and so here are my suggestions as to why the price may be different. So why there is this arbitrage opportunity. So, well, first let's look at a product that is uniquely suited for this kind of question, and that's McDonald's Big Mac. The beauty of Big Mac is that McDonald's does business in just about every country on the planet. And just in about country on the planet, it sells Big Macs. And Big Macs are identically made in all of those locations. And moreover, they are usually made from local ingredients. So the transportation cost is kind of taken care of, as well as import tariffs are taken care of. Because 2 main reasons why prices are different in different locations is because if the product is made, let's say in New York, transporting it to Manhattan is not expensive, but transporting it to Beijing is expensive. So right there you have an increase in price. On top of that, there may be an import tariff on the product in, let's say, Beijing, and as a result you would have an even higher price. So McDonald's, as I said, normally is made from local ingredients, unless the country doesn't have any agriculture, that wheat or lettuce or meat would be imported. But most countries have some agriculture going on, so as a result, the price can usually be kind of local, right? Still, you would see a different price for McDonald's and for Big Mac, and here is a graph that shows how much the price could differ. So, for example, on this map here, you see that you have the United States as the baseline, and so assuming the price in the United States is base, you would see that, for example, in Switzerland, a Big Mac would cost about 60% more than it does in the United States. So if in the United States it costs about $3, in Switzerland it's going to cost more like $5. And then if you go, for example, to China or Malaysia, it's actually going to cost about 60% less. So in China, it's usually about $1.30 or $1.50, so less than half of what it costs in the United States. And so once you have a specific product in mind, it's much easier to think about why the price may be different, provided that transportation and import tariffs are not a factor here. And so here are some kinds of, or all kinds of reasons. Well, first, it could be availability of the ingredients, and while they are local, they may be cheaper in one country versus another. So, for example, meat could be cheaper, wheat, flour could be cheaper, and so that can determine the price of the final product. Wages can be different, so a person working in McDonald's in Manhattan is probably making $15 to $20 an hour, but a person working at McDonald's in, let's say, a smaller town in China probably makes $1 an hour, and that could be a reason for a different price. Taxes can be different. Cost of land and facilities, again, renting a shop for McDonald's in Manhattan will cost you more than somewhere in a smaller town. Could be some sort of bribes, again, McDonald's, I don't think bribes are involved in that business, but in some businesses you have to kind of smooth your way by paying bribes, and that may add to the price. Size of the retailers, the logistics, the network, the efficiency with which the product can be delivered to the retail site. Technology, all those kinds of things can in different ways affect prices of products. Now, the reason I brought that up is because that brings us to the next question, which is the cost of living. So the exchange rates, that's one thing, but it is true that life costs different in different locations. So if you want to live in, again, let's use Manhattan as an example, you probably have to make at least $3,000-4,000 a month just to survive, just to have some sort of a place and just to have some sort of food. At the same amount, you can probably live fairly comfortably for $200 in many locations per month in many locations on this planet. Now, recall when we talked about purchasing power parity, when we talked about economic development. Remember, we looked at that graph where we looked at how much a dollar can buy in, for example, the United States versus Switzerland versus Czech Republic. So the GDP per capita in those countries were drastically different. But once you take into account the cost of living, those numbers would change dramatically. So, for example, in Czech Republic at that time, the cost of living, the GDP per capita was about $10,000. But the cost of living was half of what it was in the United States. So if you take that into account, you basically would live on $10,000 a month, or on $10,000 in general in Czech Republic, to the same level as it would cost you to spend $20,000 in the United States. Same thing here. So you can have less money in some locations, but because of the cheaper prices, lower cost of living, you can actually buy more with that money. So that's where that Big Mac comes into the play. Now, here is a question for you to test if you now know what the Big Mac index is. And the answer clearly is B. It's a method for estimating comparative cost of living and sometimes even exchange rates in different countries. Now, the Big Mac index is closely related to the concept of purchasing power parity. Again, as we talked a few lectures back, purchasing power parity allows you to adjust the prices or the cost of living or the income in nominal dollars. So basically to adjust you to the real purchasing power of that dollar. So for example, a $10 is a bill, or $10 is $10, right? But in the United States, it may be actually less than in China, because this in the United States doesn't get you much. But in some locations on this planet, this is a lot of money. And so while the nominal price, $10, is the same, you can definitely afford much more with that same piece of paper. And so that's where purchasing power parity comes into play. So yes, people in some countries may be making much fewer of these papers, but with those fewer papers, they can buy much more wealth or many more products or services. And so that's why it's so important, because if you simply look at the nominal figures in somebody's salary or expenses, it may not be the whole picture as to what kind of living the person can buy with that money. Now, when we also talk about inflation versus weak currency, and we talked about that, it's important to note that yes, there is some relationship between inflation and the strength of the currency. Countries that experience constant high levels of inflation clearly will have a weak currency. But at the same time, in most cases, inflation is not really a factor in the currency exchange rates. It may actually be more of a consequence rather than a predictor. So it is true when the exchange rate changes, inflation is likely to change as well. For example, look at Russia or Ukraine in 2015. Both countries have experienced dramatic swings in the exchange rate of their currencies. And that in turn led to higher inflation. So just like when the dollar is now 4 times as expensive as it was in Ukraine a few months ago, so are the prices for some especially imported products. Same thing in Russia. In fact, inflation in those countries has reached, for some categories of products, the level exactly commensurable with the level of exchange rate swings. Now, what can a government do to affect the exchange rate? We hear all the time the accusations that a government manipulates the currency exchange rates. For example, in the 80s, the world was accusing Japan of manipulating its currency exchange rate. Presumably the Japanese government was keeping the Japanese currency artificially underpriced, so weak, low, and that made buying products from Japan easier for other countries, and as a result the Japanese manufacturers had an edge, had a competitive advantage compared to other to manufacturers from other countries. Later on in the 90s and especially the 2000s, the same accusations have been addressed to China. And many people doubt those accusations. They say, well, maybe the Japanese were just making better products, or maybe the Chinese are just making equally good products for a lower price. And so people buy them from China not because of some sort of a conspiracy or manipulation with the currency, but just because the products cost less. But then still, manipulations or currency exchange rates on the one hand could have been affected by those governments, but more important, we know there was a way to affect them. And so the question becomes what a government can do to either weaken or strengthen its currency, or better yet, to either keep it stable or to overprice or underprice it. And there are all kinds of mechanisms. And again, I strongly encourage you to pause here and to think for yourself, to try to come up with the reasons before I give you the answers. That will help you, one, better understand the issue. Two, when you will hear the answers, they will make much more sense to you. So pause, take a 2-minute break, and try to think for yourself what a government can do to increase or reduce the price of its currency. And here are some of the examples. Well, to weaken the currency, you basically have to increase supply of the currency. If you remember Economics 101, supply, demand, price, that's the thing. So the more something is available, the cheaper is the price for that product. And the more scarce something is, the more expensive the price of that product becomes. And as we discussed, a currency is just another form of wealth, another product. Just like a cell phone is a product, so is this. And so the biggest or the strongest or pretty much the only method to lower price of this is to make more of these or to increase the supply of them. And so you can do all kinds of things. Well, obviously you can simply print more money, and if you print more money, the price will obviously go down. But that's a risky proposition because printing money will also lead to inflation and all kinds of other problems. Plus, in many countries, the government doesn't even have the control of over how much money is printed. In many cases, the central bank would be rather independent, and you cannot just tell them to print a few extra $1 billion or whatever currency you use. But what a government can do, and again, sometimes it's under the jurisdiction of the central bank that is kind of independent, but still part of the government. You can lower interest rates. So private banks choose what interest rates they charge for money, but the central bank sets what we call the prime interest rate, and that's the rate at which the banks can borrow from the government or from the central bank. And usually that rate has a tremendous effect on all rates in the country. So if the banks can borrow currency cheaply from the central bank, they usually can lend them cheaply and vice versa. And so by lowering interest rates, you kind of make the money cheaper to obtain because it costs less. So in the interest, it's basically a price of, for renting money. And if there is a lower price on renting money, people can rent more of it, so there is more money in the, money is more easier obtainable, and as a result, the price of it goes down, the exchange rate of it goes down. You can also lower taxes, because again, money, that's how much of it is in circulation, and so if you increase taxes, more of it will stay in the coffers of the government. But if you reduce taxes, more of the money will stay in the pockets of the consumers, of the people, and as a result, there will be more of that available, so the supply of money increases, and so as a result, the price of it goes down. The government can also try to artificially exchange the pieces of paper that represent government securities for dollars, and so what that is, you have all kinds of bonds and all kinds of other financial instruments, and the government can use its money reserves and buy those financial instruments. So you basically go on the market and you buy governmental, either shares of government companies or bonds or whatever other instruments are available. And by doing so, you reduce supply of this and you increase supply of this, and as a result the price of this goes down. That's a very clever method because it doesn't change the number of kind of dollars or wealth in the system. So you just exchange one for another, and so as a result that wouldn't trigger inflation, or at least shouldn't trigger the inflation right away, and at the same time allows you to vary that supply of dollars or whatever currency you use and affect its exchange rate. Same thing, you can, for example, try to sell foreign currencies. And let me see if I have any here with me. I don't, but I have checks, and so assume that that's it. Let's pretend that that's a foreign currency. So as a government, you can start buying this stuff for this stuff, and so this will be more available in the market, and so as a result, the price of this currency will go down while the price of this currency will go up. Again, it's kind of costly because you have to have those foreign currencies to do it, but if you have those resources, you can do it. And so the opposite is basically available for strengthening the currency. I mean, if you want your currency exchange rate to go up, you increase taxes, you increase interest rates, you basically make your money less available, and so they will become more expensive as far as the exchange rate. I'm not sure why you would want to do that unless your economy is overheating or there are other reasons you want to, limit exports and things like that. But otherwise, I wouldn't probably do it, but if you needed to, that's a method. Then you can also sell government securities. So you can try selling government securities and other financial instruments, and that will create demand for dollars. So the dollars will go back to you, and supply of them in the market will shrink. And as a result, the price of dollars, or the exchange rate of dollar, will go up. Or again, whatever currency is used in your country. Same thing, so you can use foreign currencies to buy your own currency, and I'll use this fake bill here again. So you start buying this with this, and so the price of this goes up, and again, I'm not sure if your government will have the resources to do it, but if you do, if you have to, you could. In fact, that's what allegedly the Russian government is doing right now. As you know, the price of oil went dramatically down, and we'll talk some other time about why that happened. There are all kinds of theories, and it's not really that important in this case. The point here is that as the price of oil went down, Russian ruble started losing its value, and so as of today, it's about $55, 55 rubles per dollar, which is twice as much as it was just a few months ago. And at some point, it actually reached $70, rubles per dollar. And clearly that led to a panic and inflation, and people were trying to sell their currency, rubles, which is not good for the economy. And so what allegedly the Russian government is doing to keep ruble strong, it's buying ruble right and left using foreign reserves and using gold reserves. And when you look at the figures for the for the foreign currency and the gold reserves for the Russian Central Bank in the 2015, you will see that it shrunk from something like 600 billion to about 300 billion in a matter of a few months. So it's a huge amount, a huge reduction. And so presumably the reason it shrunk is because the government was using that resource to buy out rubles and thereby trying to reduce their supply, and thereby trying to keep them more expensive, trying to keep their exchange rate back to where it was. Again, right or wrong, is it actually happening? Well, nobody would admit, but we see that the numbers say, and that those are the numbers actually provided by the Russian government. So who knows how it is in reality? Maybe it's even much worse than people say, or maybe not, who knows. But those are the mechanisms, the tools that are available to the government to keep the currency either strong and prevent inflation, or weak and stimulate exports. But again, it's very expensive, and in some cases, in fact in most cases in the long run, none of those interventions are going to do much good. So it's only for repairing short-term problems. Now, here is a question that we asked at the beginning of the lecture, very similar, and so let's see if you know the answer now. And the answer clearly is, You cannot say any of that based on the information provided. Unless you know the actual dynamics over time, you wouldn't be able to say anything. Just because one currency is more expensive than another, it doesn't actually mean that it is. As I was saying, for example, the Japanese yen, today the exchange rate is about 120 Japanese yen to $1. And 120 to 1, it does mean that the Japanese economy is 120 times doing worse. It's just a different exchange rate. If you knew that at some point it was 80 and now it's 120, you could say that probably today it's doing worse compared to where it was before. Yes. But again, in this question, you only have two numbers and you don't know where they were before, so that's all you have. Now, so strong currency, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, as we said, a strong currency, and by strong I mean overpriced here. I mean currency like, for example, the United States dollar, as of today, it seems to be overpriced. It's much more expensive today than it was just a few months ago. So as of today, in fact, this very morning, the United States dollar cost one euro costs $1.08. So it's almost 1 to 1 now, and it was 1.4 just literally a few months ago. So clearly, euro is probably underpriced, and dollar is probably overpriced today. Is it good or bad? Well, it's good and bad. Good because for the Europeans, it's good because European products all of a sudden are more attractive to foreigners. And so European manufacturers are now in a much better situation than their American counterparts. And it's bad for American counterparts for the same reasons. At the same time, a stronger dollar means that the American consumers can buy more, so all of a sudden imports become cheaper and you can buy more stuff from overseas for less money. If you are a manufacturer, for example, this Motorola phone was actually made in the United States. It's probably the only one that is made in the United States, Moto X. And I know that it has many components from all around the world. It probably has a battery from somewhere else. It probably has a screen from, I'm not even sure who makes them, but possibly Samsung. So I'm sure Motorola does some parts of it here in the United States, and obviously the assembly, but I have no doubt that some components come from overseas. And so when the American dollar is more expensive, it may be more expensive for Motorola to sell these things overseas, or I guess Google, who owns them now. But it's cheaper for them to buy ingredients, components for this phone. And so as a result, it actually makes it cheaper for them to make that phone if many components come from somewhere else. So that may actually help to some companies, especially those that depend on imported parts and components. It may also strengthen business in the long run. So if all of a sudden you are in a disadvantaged position selling your products, you have to innovate. You have to make your business model more efficient. And it's tough. Some may not survive, but those who will actually be better off, because in countries where the currency is weak now, where exporting from where it is easy, they may relax too much, and before they know it, they may be overtaken by their competition that is more efficient and more productive. Now, exchange rates, you can read that in the book, but this part I'm sure you know. This part is very easy, and so here you have basically exchange rates of one currency to another, and you can kind of do it both ways. So you can say that $1 costs 1.1 euros, but 1 euro costs $0.9 or something like that. And so it's easy to calculate that, pure math. I have no doubt that you can do it without my help, but if you don't, just look at the slide, read the book, look online. So this is pure math, very easy stuff. And some formulas here that I'm not gonna focus on. Now, more practical stuff. When you have to buy a foreign currency, you have a number of options. And those options may vary dramatically in terms of how much you would be paying for the same amount of the currency. I'll give you an example. When I moved to the United States from Canada in 2008, as I said, I did have some savings in Canadian dollars, and it was, again, not a huge amount of money, but it was big for me at that time. And plus, it was sufficient to buy a kind of average townhouse in a small town where I currently live. So it was a substantial amount of money for me. To change that money into American dollars did have its price. And so soon enough, I realized that I have a number of options. And when I looked at those options, I realized that I could be losing or saving $2,000 to $3,000 depending on what exchange method I choose. So we're talking about a substantial, huge amount of money. I mean, for many people, $2,000 to $3,000, that's like a monthly salary, and for many probably that's an annual salary. And so I could pay that extra or save that depending on where I go to change my money. And so let me talk about those different options so you know next time when you go overseas or when you do business and you have to buy products overseas, especially if it's a business and it's, bigger purchases, not just, a pair of socks that you may buy on eBay. So let me tell you what options you will have. So first big differentiation is what we call a spot rate versus buy-sell rate. So the spot rate, that's the rate that banks kind of exchange currencies or swap currencies at. So for example, when you listen to the news and they give you the exchange rate, they say, well, euro today costs $1.1, right? So they give you only one number, and that only one number, that's the spot rate, and that's basically the exchange rate at which big banks swap currencies, because they don't technically buy it from one another. They just basically exchange currencies, right? So one needs dollars, one needs euros, and so it's a mutually beneficial exchange. For the rest of us, simple mortals, people, companies, we would be paying a different price depending on whether we are buying or selling currency. And so the best example of that would be a money exchange stand like this one, like what you would see, for example, in airports. When you land, you would always see those exchange booths, and you would see two numbers for each currency. So for example, on this picture here, you can see that if you wanted to buy Canadian dollar, you would be paying 95 cents for each of them. But if you wanted to sell Canadian dollar, you will get only 88 cents. And the difference between those two numbers is what we call the spread. And usually the spread kind of shows you how risky the currency is. So when you look at these different currencies here, or go to a currency exchange booth anywhere in your town, you will see that for some currencies the spread is very small. It's like plus or minus 2%. But for some it would be huge. Like for example, if you looked at the spreads for Russian ruble today, you will see that it's more like plus 10%, minus 10%. And the reason for that is because the currency is so volatile, so changing so quickly. So the only way the bank knows that they will be making money on exchanges is when they charge more for the transaction. So, but either way, you're probably going to be paying anywhere between 2 to 3% for the exchange of the currency that you're buying, or more if the currency is more volatile. And again, when you come to a new country and when you're just exchanging a small amount of money, like a couple $100s, it's probably not a big deal. So what? You lose $1 or $2 extra on every 100, but it's not going to make you, rich or poor. But the story changes dramatically when you have to exchange a huge amount of money. Again, as I said, if you work for a company that sells combines, one of those things costs like $250,000. So you easily could be changing, paying extra $5,000 to $10,000 if you wanted to buy that product overseas. And so that's all of a sudden, that's a big deal. That's like an extra car that you can buy for yourself. So the options that you would have would be banks, would be online traders, and would be special accounts within banks. And here is an example of how much it would cost you to buy a particular amount of currency. And here I use $100,000 US as an example, from different banks at the same time. So as you can see, the transaction cost can cost you anywhere between $25 and almost $4,000. So it's a huge difference. And so when the time came for me to buy roughly that amount of money, I went to my bank, and the bank told me, yes, sure, you can buy that money, and the spread will be about 3%. So which means on an amount of roughly $100,000, a little less than that, I would be losing about $3,000 right there. Huge amount of money. Then I looked online, and so there were all kinds of exchange rates, exchange places online, like for example, what you would see here, right? And there are many places like that. many of them would have a fixed amount, fixed price, and usually it's about $25 to $200 per exchange, regardless of how much money you have. So for example, we'll look here at one where the price is, I believe these guys charge a fixed $25 regardless of the amount of money that you're buying. Now, I did some research on the online traders, and the responses were very positive. It seems like they are legit, it seems like they are honest, and it seems like it actually works. Eventually, though, I decided not to use them because it felt like if something goes wrong, I could potentially lose everything. In order to exchange money with those guys, you literally have to transfer your funds to their account first, and then they would transfer the same amount of money in your account but in a different currency. And since there is no address, since there is no building, brick and mortar place, you can't really, if something goes wrong, you don't even know where to go. I mean, like this place, as I said, where do you go? Where do you complain? Who they are? I mean, whom do you argue with? So that becomes a problem. And so I felt that, if I lose an extra 1,000 or 2 on the exchange, it's not going to make me much poorer. It's not going to change my, financial situation by much. But if I lose all of it, that's basically all my life savings, so that's a big deal. Eventually, I found an option that was much more suitable for me, which was what they called American dollar account offered by the Canadian bank that I was with at that time, Toronto Dominion. So what that account does is it allows you to exchange dollars Canadian to dollars American at a preferred rate. And it was roughly 1% instead of about 3% that was used by default. The trick with that account is that you have to pay a monthly fee, and it was something like $25, and you had to keep a certain amount of money in that account. In my case, it made sense to open that account, to pay the $25 fee for that account for that 1 month. Since I had the money, the necessary amount, and I can't remember what it was, but I believe it was no less than $10,000. I could do that. And so what I did was I opened the account, I transferred the needed amount of money, in fact all of it. I did the transaction, I paid my 1% or so for the transaction, but then once that was done, I just basically withdrew the money and closed the account. So all it cost me extra was that 1 month fee of about $25, but it saved me about $2,000 on the transaction, and so that seemed to be totally worth it. All right, well, here is what you need to know on the exam. It's a fascinating topic. As I said, there is more to it than just, knowing what exchange rates are. And we'll talk some more about it in the next lecture.